most of you, but just in case, I'm Nigel Rodley. I'm the chair of the Human Rights Centre, listed in that capacity that I'm introducing this session, which I'm very happy to do. This lecture event marks the third year of the formal partnership between the Human Rights Centre and the International Centre for Human Rights and Drug Policy. It was established in 2009, that's the HR, and has already developed an excellent reputation for human rights research and teaching on drug-related issues involving enforcement, policy, and treatment. It's hosted events around the globe, including academics and lecturers. It promotes and disseminates high-quality research, and its flagship publication is the Human Rights and Drugs Journal. It's published annually, and it's peer-reviewed. Generally, the HRDP supports academic research policy development that aims to reconcile international drug control conventions with international human rights law. The Human Rights Centre is very pleased to be associated with the International Centre, even if its name is longer than our name. The partnership has been a great success over the last few years, and we've still got to realise its great potential. Already, our clinic is encouraging submissions to international machinery of various sorts, some of which I suspect I may have been associated with or be associated with, on human rights and drug policy issues. So I'm glad I don't know what those projects are. The partnership has been made possible thanks to the vision and leadership of the co-directors of the HRDP, Rick Lyons, who's here, and Damon Barrett, and as well as the guidance of Noam Nupel, who's now the head of the law school. And also, of course, thanks to the very generous support of the Open Society Foundation, who's, and indeed our featured guest today is from the Open Society Foundation, Joanna Cheta. And I'm going to leave it to Rick to present and introduce Joanna to you. And the rest of you, I'm looking forward to hearing what promises to be a very stimulating lecture on a topic that I'm still amazed is a real topic. It's as though once the United States went through the process of banning alcohol prohibition, and then failing in that, they decided to try the same trick on the rest of the world, and the rest of the world is still pursuing policies that are both criminogenic and human rights issues generic as well. It's hard to know how we're going to get out of what is seemingly an intractable political problem, where everybody knows that the emperor has no clothes, but everybody's scared of the idea of losing elections if they're admitted. So, over to you, Rick.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much, Professor Rodley. Yeah, I'm very pleased to be able to welcome Joanna Cheta here to speak with us today. Joanne, in sort of our sector, is one of the really rare, I think, individuals who is outstanding both as an academic, but also working in the NGO world and as an advocate. I've known Joanne for many years, back when she was the founder of the HIV and Human Rights program at Human Rights Watch, and later went on to be the executive director of the Canadian HIV and AIDS Legal Network, which is based in Toronto, which is one of the world's leading NGOs working on the intersection between human rights and HIV across various parts of the world, not only in Canada. She's an adjunct professor now at the Milne School of Public Health at Columbia University, and is currently working as the deputy director of the Global Drug Policy Program at the Open Society Foundations. As that Joanne brings a wealth of experience, not just in issues specifically related to HIV and drug policy, which I suppose is where her primary work has been in recent years, but indeed in the broad range of issues related to health and human rights. and Joanne has a long-standing professional involvement as well as political commitment to working on health and human rights issues in Africa. And I think she's going to sort of combine many of those different areas of experience in her presentation today. So I'd like to welcome Joanne.
Thanks very much. Thanks all of you for taking the time. I gather you're in a period where some of you have finished exams, but you have lots of things to do, I'm sure. So I appreciate that you're all here today. I have to say that it's a bit daunting to be here because I guess anyone who works on human rights or aspires to work on human rights or pretends to work on human rights has known this place as a Mecca, and it's a rather weighty privilege to be here with you. I'm really honored to meet Professor Rodley, having appreciated and learned from his work so much. In that regard, I also want to start by recognizing the pioneering work of Professor Hunt, who, as the first UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health, helped us to bring the issue of drugs to both the health and the human rights worlds in a certain sense. And I think from what he said, and I've given you and we'll leave the slides if people want them, I have a lot of URLs on them, but this speech that was entitled, I think, Parallel Universes and States Amnesia was about how it is that we have this horrible situation of international drug law that essentially developed without any regard to international human rights law. And I think in his statements and his challenges to the then Human Rights Council, Commission on Human Rights, on this issue, he also inspired his successor, Anand Grover, to write on this issue, and it's been extremely helpful for us to have things with UN stamps on them that contain statements like this, so I wanted to express my gratitude to him, and I'm sorry. Let's see. I'm going to suppose that the remarks that Professor Rutland just made are not completely Chinese to you, that you have some idea that there is this drug policy. The United States has a huge role in this drug policy, and there's a global drug regime, there are national drug regimes, and that they are criticized, and that they're criticized with the human rights lens. I mean, part of my other being daunted by being here is that I had thought, especially having been myself a professor at a university where students are very exacting, that I should come to you with a formal sort of research presentation, and that's not what this is. And that's partly because I did want to say something about Africa, and I think that the work on drugs, human rights, and drug policy and human rights in Africa, the research that needs to be done has not yet been done. So I consider this talk more a chance to inspire you perhaps to think in those directions as you pursue your careers in human rights or whatever fields you're in. But this is an infographic. Infographics are wonderful, aren't they? That comes from some research that our foundation did sponsor at the University of British Columbia in Canada, that actually just did some putting together of data on expenditures on drug seizures, which is in a lot of places how we measure, how policymakers measure their effectiveness. Oh, if I move around, is that a problem?
No, it's fine.
Okay. Seizures, arrests, those are the kinds of indicators that are used to measure the effectiveness of drug policy in the policy world. And what the researchers at UBC did was put together the data on how much seizures, in particular interdiction of drug supply, is invested in, and put that against the price of drugs and the purity of drugs on the street. And what we see is that investing in more seizures somehow has absolutely no effect. If anything, the perverse effect on supply, that is, it seems that drugs on the streets are in greater supply. So we have this story, which I think can be captured in many ways, and as Professor Rodley said, we know that the emperor has new clothes if we look on an empirical level. And the human rights issues also, I think, are relatively clear, and we can spell out a few of them. This is from the year 2001, which was kind of the peak of the over-incarceration, the mass incarceration linked to drugs phenomenon in the U.S. So you see the incarceration rates in some Western European countries, and there you see the incarceration rate in the United States. And believe me, we are paying for that in many, many ways in the United States and communities of people of color in particular, because if we look at these incarceration data, what you have here is 1980 is the pink, in case you can't see it, 2004 is the blue. We have for all populations, again, a rate of incarceration per population, per thousand population if you like. Young men without secondary school education, without having completed, who didn't complete secondary school. That's for white men. Again, if we put the figures next to that for African American men, we see that this is a story of a drug war that has a very particular agenda that should make us all think about it in human rights terms. And we've had better research on this phenomenon in recent years, and I think we've had historians also say this term drug war is usually accredited to the term itself to Richard Nixon, who was elected president of the United States in 1968. Right after the most sweeping civil rights legislation in the history of the United States passed through the Congress, I think that there are many historians now who really think it is a consensus position to say that it is no accident that a drug war that particularly targeted Black Americans happened at that particular moment in history when the white Republican establishment was under great pressure to be sure that especially the urban Blacks were put in their place. Their place turned out in too many cases to be prisons, and so what we have in many communities in the United States is whole populations of young Black men who, at a very high percentage of them, even up to 1/3 in some communities, are either on probation, in pretrial detention, in prison, somewhere else in the criminal justice system. It's a stunning result, again, that has enormous costs for all of society. We also know, and I think Nigel South from Sociology and others have written about this, that one of the elements of this drug war, especially with respect to coca cultivation in the Andes, has been aerial eradication or forced manual eradication of coca plants. When eradication is done this way, with toxic chemicals sprayed from an airplane at low altitude, the American company Monsanto makes out very well because they provide the chemicals, but the rest of the people involved don't do so well, and this has caused enormous migration, health problems, miscarriages, all kinds of toxicity issues, as well as the destruction of livelihoods in addition to the coca plants, because coca is sometimes planted near food crops, as you can imagine. I think that one of the reasons that we are getting as far as we are in bringing some of in going back to a kind of global revisiting of drug policy is that the Latin American countries, which have been very, very hard hit by mortality linked to drug-related gang violence, are speaking up and saying that they've had enough, that they see this as a US imposed policy, it's ruining their communities and the safety of their streets. I think now the figure that the Mexicans use is that they've had almost 100,000 deaths, essentially violent deaths on the street linked to drug-related gang violence. When I worked for the UN, we were constantly bombarded by memos saying that today was World Day of whatever it is, and I thought, well, that's fine if you can mobilize public awareness or whatever with a World Day of something, that's fine, but the World Day Against Drugs, which is June 27th? 6th. June 26th. We found that in some countries it was celebrated by public executions of people convicted of drug offenses, and that was true in China and a few other places. And that's when you think, well, maybe the World Day of whatever it is.
So if it's June the 26th, it also happens to be the World Day for the victims of the war.
Yeah, it's exactly the same day.
It's the same day. Oh, that's interesting. And I'm also very grateful to Professor Nigel South's, your own Nigel South's work on this subject of the hype that surrounded the drug war. The hype was not only racist and explicitly in some elements, but it also did not correspond to any science that we have of addiction or what drugs are all about. And one of the things that Nigel South has pointed out so well in his work is that in the US in particular, there's the habit of talking about all drugs as though they're the same, as though they are equally dangerous. And so I grew up seeing advertisements like this. This is your brain, that's the egg, this is your brain on drugs fried. We say this, and of course, we in the universities would do takeoffs of this. I say this in a humorous way, but in fact, what we know now, and we're beginning to get this accounting too in the United States, is that we have spent billions, I mean, tens of billions certainly of taxpayer dollars over the years on school-based programs like the ones I had to sit through, like the ones Barack Obama had to sit through, that basically said all drugs are bad, your life will be ruined if you take any drug. And Barack Obama, the future president of the United States, hearing this message when he was part of a secondary school marijuana club. You know, after a while, what we have is wasted billions, because not only are the messages ineffective, but people who are hearing them know very well that they're not effective because they've all tried drugs, or many of them have, and they know that their brain doesn't get instantly fried. As I mentioned, we also had particularly racially targeted messages that the mass media were part of as well. The 1980s crack epidemic, where we were told constantly in the media that there would be a generation of crack babies who would be dependent on the state and so on. We know now in public health terms there was never anything like what was said in the media, and lots of, again, African Americans really took the heat for that. But in a way that's not new. I ran into this article from the New York Times in 1914 about the Negro cocaine fiends. So while the racism in the late 1960s and early 1970s had a particular historical moment, it was not a new moment in that sense in U.S. history. Anyway, there's no question also that we would not have the attention to global drug policy that we have today were it not for the link between drugs, especially drug injection and HIV. And I'd like for you to appreciate that where we are in the global HIV epidemic is well represented by these slides. We're seeing, even in Africa, where the epidemic has been the worst, generally a decline in new cases, a decline in AIDS-related deaths. That is generally. But what we see, and I apologize if this is hard to see, what we see if we look at those changes over time by region, and I wish that there were a better slide for this, is that the region where drugs are most responsible for, are most important in the etiology of HIV, or the most important driver of HIV transmission, we see the least amount of improvement. What you have here is the blue bars are men in 2001 and 2002, the darker one, and women are gray. And we see that this is virtually the only region where there's not some improvement between 2001 and 2002, except for among women, which is an interesting figure. And Asia and the Pacific, almost a similar case. Those figures are really hard to interpret because China is so important in them, but you also have many countries where there's simply no improvement in the HIV picture because HIV is mostly concentrated among drug users and other people who don't really have a policy constituency. And of course, this is a story about not providing the, as we call them, harm reduction services, the HIV prevention services that we know work, that are cost effective, that are not in any sense costly. It's not costly to give people clean needles to be sure that they have clean needles. And yet there are relatively few countries, and here the good guys are the dark red. So Australia, for instance, has a largely drug-related HIV epidemic in a certain sense, but very low HIV prevalence among drug users because the services are so readily available. And even the matter of giving people who use drugs treatment for HIV once they are HIV positive is actually scandalously bad in many countries. These are some of the countries with the biggest HIV epidemics among people who inject drugs, and you see that you would think those would be the people first in the queue for HIV medicine, and for a very long time we had to fight the idea that people who use drugs can't stick to a daily regime of HIV medicines, which is kind of crazy because because they know how to take drugs daily. But we have this still as a great challenge all over the world. Another part of this drug war that we don't think about that I would like to see the human rights world a lot more engaged in, if I had my preference, my old organization of Human Rights Watch is coming around to this issue in a big way. Caught in this net of drug war, surveillance and interdiction and supply side interventions is also the morphine that people need for pain management and the methadone that people need to treat opiate addiction. And so we have enormous numbers of countries in the world, large swaths of the world where there is really no registration of morphine for pain management because governments are afraid that that will somehow find its way to the street or that they will somehow be under international scrutiny for having those controlled substances in their hospitals. This is a terrible, terrible catastrophe, and one that, again, is kind of a neglected part of the drug war consequences. There are other factors that go into this, and certainly there are places in the world where doctors are not well trained to use opiates, for instance, for pain management, but all of that is easily remedied. I think the policy resistance is much harder. So we will really get to Africa. I just wanted to start a little bit. This is a geopolitical story, and I'm not formally trained in geopolitics by any means, but this is a story really that's about how the United States developed drug control as part of its foreign policy in its long relationship with Latin America. And what we see that is that from the mid-1990s, there was huge expenditure on counter-narcotics as part of U.S. foreign assistance. At first, non-military assistance, increasingly more and more militarized as time went on, and especially in the form of a program that started actually at the end of the Clinton years called Plan Colombia, which added up over these years from 1996 to about 2012 to something over $8 billion worth of, again, taxpayer money. We had a senator, a prominent senator called Everett Dirksen when I was growing up, and he used to say $500 million here, $500 million there, soon you're talking real money. And this really is real money. And what you see also in the blue, which is Central America or Mexico, I guess, in the later years is a program that came on top of Plan Colombia called the Merida Initiative that also supported military intervention in counter-narcotics areas. Now, the boundary between counter-narcotics and other things is what makes this so tricky. And of course, during this period of Plan Colombia, Colombia's main concern is with the FARC, with the insurgent group that it was dealing with across its territory. I would say as well that an important moment in all of this war on drugs is, in fact, September 11th, 2001, for the very reason that if the drug war was losing steam by that point, it picked up a lot of energy because very quickly the people in power in the Bush administration realized that they could conflate the war on drugs with the war on terror, and they would get a lot more support from the Congress and the people for funding counter-narcotics, which was beginning to peter out a little bit at around the time. What we can say about the Plan Colombia is that from the point of view of actually reducing, Plan Colombia also had, was focused on Colombia, but there was eradication of coca crops also in Peru and Bolivia, the other big producers. And what we see, and we could continue this past 2006, but it doesn't show as nicely on the slides that I have from that period, but what you see here is that when there was progress in reducing coca production in Peru, it sprung up in Colombia. When there was progress in Colombia, it sprung up in Bolivia. What we call the balloon effect. There may have been some movement and some temporary eradication of coca in one location, but overall, by the US's own figures, and believe me, they have every interest in showing reductions in coca production, there is no real reduction in coca production. So we have what is an enormously expensive, enormously harmful policy for the people that in fact on its own terms fails. And this was not, it wasn't secret what was going on in Colombia, and the Colombian media, the political commentators, they were very critical of this relationship with the United States. This one is meant to be Álvaro Uribe, the president of Colombia, and the then drug czar of the United States, General Walters. I'm afraid this one is a little vulgar. Basically says Colombia and the United States sign a military accord, and it has Barack Obama, who inherited this program and did not end it. It wasn't his to end, really. The Congress was still giving it money, saying, wait, Álvaro, this occasion merits a special pen. See what he's doing. Anyway, it's meant to say what the U.S. was doing to Colombia in the course of this Plan Colombia. Sorry for the vulgarity there. Plan Colombia became so controversial with the small left wing, there is a small left wing in the U.S. Congress, that it actually inspired what we call the Leahy Amendment. Senator Patrick Leahy, a Democrat from the state of Vermont, one of the most progressive members of the U.S. Congress, was able to put into the authorizing legislation the foreign assistance bill that was supporting Plan Colombia way back in 2000, I think this was, this provision that there should never be, through these counter-narcotics efforts, which were becoming increasingly militarized, gross violations of human rights by military units receiving U.S. support, U.S. foreign assistance. This was a major step in U.S. Legislative history, and the Leahy Amendment is something that I use often at Human Rights Watch. All of us used it in various ways for our own work, because it doesn't apply just to drug-related activities. It applies to all kinds of things where the U.S. might be supporting military or quasi-military activities. The question is, how effective is something like that? Well, it remains a challenge. There's an independent group called the Congressional Research Service. I think they really are nonpartisan. You can find their report about the Leahy Amendment from this year, earlier this year, in which they cite Colombia as a best practice. It was the country that, in the experience that inspired the Leahy the amendment in the first place, that there are people sitting in the U.S. Embassy who actually go out and investigate cases that we hear about of violations by the military and so on. And yet the UN Special Rapporteurs, the human rights organizations, other independent observers constantly are saying, look, your net is letting too many things escape. You're not detecting some of the worst violations. Anyway, we have a serious human rights challenge here. Another thing that we might say about the U.S. support over this time, again, in 1970, 80, 90s, U.S. support for counter-narcotics activities in Latin America is very, very strong. U.S. influence on policy making, very strong. And what happens to, these are minimum penalties for drug-related offenses in the countries, 7 countries of Latin America. And you see what happens. I mean, in Colombia itself, the minimum penalty is something like 15 years. Minimum penalty is 15 years for a drug trafficking offense. And for certain minor offenses, also very, very high minimum. So this is part of the package. This is a use of criminal law that the human rights world and Rick and Damon and their work in the center have very much questioned, and rightly so. I think I'll skip that one. Before we get to Africa, I just did want to sort of open a parentheses and say, is there a better way to do this? I mean, Latin Americans have strong human rights movements. They've been through a period of democratization. What's happening? Well, what's happening that's really interesting to me, from a human rights perspective anyway, is the Bolivian experience. Bolivia has made the case, and I'll come back to how they've done that with respect to the international drug conventions, but Bolivia has made the case that there is a traditional use of coca leaf that should be legal, that always has been legal in Bolivia, and that Bolivia sort of got pushed into criminalizing all uses of coca leaf while it had a military government that wasn't hearing from the people, and that just sort of signed up under US pressure to criminalization of all uses of coca. Now the president of Bolivia is a former coca farmer named Evo Morales. He's a very colorful figure, and if you have a chance to hear him speak on the subject of coca leaf, you should do. He's come to the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs a number of times with all his coca tea and his coca ice cream and his coca everything. It's very interesting. And what Morales has done is basically say, look, we're looking at the livelihood of very poor people here. We need to be conscious of that. We need to work with them. And he has encouraged organization, that is to say, trade union-style organization of the coca farmers in Bolivia, and has instituted a project that they call CATO. And CATO is just the unit of measurement of the amount of land, which is about 1/10 of a hectare, that people are now legally, if they are part of one of these farmer unions, able to raise the amount of coca that they can produce for legal uses of coca, for the teas, for the ice cream, for the whatever there is. And in those communities, those same communities, where there are good organizations that the government can work with, local authorities can work with, they work on social services, they work on infrastructure development, so that in fact farmers can begin to think about other things that they can raise. Coca was often the livelihood of people in the Bolivian Andes because the drug traffickers made sure that the roads were there for them to get the coca product, the coca leaf out to where it needed to go, and that wasn't true for fruit products or other products that they might have been able to raise. That kind of thing is exactly what the Bolivian government is looking at now. Did I lose my graph? When you read the sort of protocol for doing this, it's very much human rights language. It's all about people's organizations, it's all about hearing from the people, it's all about having democratic processes for that. And it's a relatively new experience, but what's called cooperative reduction here, this is from a paper that's about to be published by Lederberg and Youngers, I think. What you see here is that there is still some of the forced eradication that was part of the pre-Morales years, but there now is very effective reduction of illicit coca production through this system because you're working with communities, you're giving them something else in the way of an alternative. It's a very interesting experience. It's one that we need to analyze more and understand the human rights elements of more. The other Andes Information Network is an organization supported by our foundation, and they did this rough count of episodes of violence. There was a lot of violence when the coca farmers were not part of decision making about eradication and so on. Now it's down to almost nothing. It's not perfect, and again, this is something that requires more study, but it's a really interesting experience and one that I think we need to think about in Africa, where a lot of these issues are the same, even though it's not coca, it's cannabis or it's cotton. But we don't have many experiences like this to point to. I won't go into this in detail. I just wanted to say that under pressure, to some degree, from some of the member states of the UN took up the challenge of guiding principles on this matter of alternative development projects or alternative development activities for people who are growing drug crops. So poppies, coca, cannabis, and so on. And the statement that was put together in a consultation that somehow involved civil society, don't ask me how that happened because it usually doesn't on drug issues, there was a very good draft, a nice progressive set of guidelines that focused a lot on sequencing. That is to say, you don't tell people to rip out their coca before you have something in place that they can support themselves with. That element stayed in the guidelines after the UN Vienna, that is to say the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, got done with these guidelines. But language on taking due account of traditional uses got knocked out by the US and others. Development assistance should not be conditioned on reductions in illicit cultivation. That also got knocked out and was something that civil society felt strongly about. So this is an area of debate. It's an area that I think also the human rights community should have something to say about. Okay, getting to Africa. I'm sorry to keep talking about Africa like a monolith. This is just to say that, again, drugs have been in a global spotlight because of the link to HIV. For a very long time in Africa, we had the view that there wasn't enough drug injection on the continent, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, to make a difference for HIV. And I think there was a lot of sweeping under the rug of what evidence there was. But what I wanted to show you here is a very public health sort of idea, which is this is the way that HIV grew, HIV transmission grew in the 1990s through sexual transmission in a place where there was relatively little control. Up till the late 90s, there weren't a lot of HIV prevention programs going on. So this is sort of the natural course of a very bad HIV epidemic, the one in South Africa. You saw that that meant growth of a few percentage points prevalence every year. This is, though, the way that HIV spreads with respect to drug injection. It's a much more efficient way to spread HIV. You're injecting the virus right into yourself. And so we see these kinds of explosive epidemics happening, not with the same population base, obviously, so the numbers are maybe not as scary as they might be, but the speed of transmission is very rapid, and that's still true today, and that's why HIV transmission in Russia, parts of Eastern Europe, Central Asia, is faster than in the rest of the world. We don't have many good figures on the number of people who inject drugs regularly in Africa, and these are rough estimations. You see that in Tanzania, the range is very, very big. But we know that it's there. And it's very, very hard to get numbers on this kind of thing because the populations are so hyper-criminalized that ordinary survey methods won't help you at all. So again, these are estimates. But what's noticeable here is the high level of HIV prevalence. I mean, when you have more than 40% prevalence in a population of HIV, it's just an enormous cost to everybody. You have huge mortality. You have a huge cost to the state one way or the other. The real concerns about drugs in Africa in a global sense and in the mass media, surely, have been in recent years where it has been realized that part of what everyone assumed was the major route of cocaine from the Andes to Europe and North America was through the Caribbean. There have been very, very strict militarized, US-supported interdiction activities in the Caribbean, and the balloon effect that we're seeing now in this case is one that practically spans the globe. So we have, with some of the routes in the Caribbean having become less attractive to traffickers, more cocaine going through, especially West Africa. To some degree, Southern Africa. In fact, a lot of things are coming together in Southern Africa, which has the middle-class consumers and is an attractive market. So this kind of picture, which I have to say is based on, again, data that are largely seizure-based, we'll talk about that in a second, in some cases very, very sketchy, definitely rubber-stamped by the UN figures that are given by governments, so who knows exactly the reliability of it. But anyway, this is the story that's beginning to make for some drum beating about do we need a new front in the war on drugs. Oops, sorry. Oh. And again, using seizure data, there are some trafficking routes that UNODC would like us to think are very well mapped out. I'm not so sure, but that's what's happening. This is heroin. You may be aware that now pretty much 85 or 6% of the heroin in the world comes not from Burma, where it used to, in Southeast Asia. Again, partly because of the Thai efforts at alternative development. Heroin is mostly coming to our part of the world from Afghanistan. And it has been found that especially the East African ports, which function fairly well but have bribable officials behind them, has been a good place to stop with the heroin. And there has been on what I call the Swahili coast, the Indian Ocean coast of Kenya and Tanzania, Zanzibar, a huge population of people who inject heroin for some years now that has been well documented. Now, UNODC, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, which is kind of a key player in all of this, has published seizure data like this about West Africa and gotten people very, very excited about it. These are tons of, in this case, kilos of, it's not huge numbers, of heroin seized. Is there any reason that you could think of why you might see a spike like that that actually isn't about the flow of heroin? Anyone? What are we looking at when we're looking at seizure data? Do you have any thoughts about that? can you think of a reason why the police, for instance, might be inclined to report more seizures than they actually make? You can probably think of a reason, yeah.
Foreign development assistance.
There you go, point that's good. Yeah, there's a lot of pressure on some countries not to be named by the US as a laggard in the drug war and things like that. We'll get to that more. That's one thing. I mean, what we're really looking at here, Rick, do you want to say anything about that?
Well, I think the seizure things are always reflective of the kind of one big haul.
Yeah.
In a small country that's already got a little bit of seizure, you find one big haul and it triples your seizures for the year.
Right. I was in a meeting at Chatham House recently with the head of Europol, who is a British fellow called Ralph Wilkinson. Anyway, he said, you know, we never use seizure data alone. We always have to triangulate, as he said. You never use seizure data alone because it's so likely to reflect a spurt of energy on the part of the police that might come from who knows where, or one big haul, as Rick said. It's not good data for showing trends. But the UN and the US are beating their chests around data like this. Now here's the flow of amphetamine that UNODC would like for us to digest here. So amphetamine type stimulus, what we call ATS, methamphetamine being the most important one. They're saying now that there's a major production and consumption center in West Africa. I'm really not sure about this because the production industry in Southeast Asia is so effective and has been able to benefit from scale economies for so long. And this is the way that they, in UNODC's report, I mean, Nigeria is a country of 170 million people. I think the number of meth labs that they found was 2. This makes it look like Nigeria is one big meth lab, doesn't it? Again, it's the sort of hype that becomes very easy when we talk about drugs. So again, this all contributes to this sort of narrative about West Africa as the new drug hellhole of the world, right? Yeah. Here's a good one. What are we looking at here? We're looking at arrest figures. We're looking at arrest figures for Nigerians arrested for methamphetamine trafficking in Malaysia. Again, is there anything going on here that might not actually be a real reflection of a trend in methamphetamine marketing by Nigerians in Malaysia? There might be, and one of the things that Nigerians will always, or at least when the ones that we work with will, in our Nigeria Foundation, will say is that one thing that we might want to remember is that it was way easier to get a Nigerian passport at various times in this period than to get certain other passports if you were interested in doing illicit things. Not that that reflects all that well in Nigeria, but a lot of these people that are alleged Nigerians might not be Nigerian. Anyway, again, it's a, you know, is this a success of our drug policy, of our drug control policy? It's hard to say because we don't really know what's inspiring, you know, whether arrests are being counted differently, whether the police in some way were pressured to show more results, all the kinds of things that we said about seizures. Now, just as the drums really are beating for West Africa as a new place to put US military hardware and surveillance activities linked to drugs, we get the boost that the Pentagon was really hoping for, which is the link to terrorism, and not just terrorism, but Al-Qaeda. So we have evidence of the resurgence of what's called Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, we call it Akim, and somebody makes a link between Al-Qaeda's activity in the Maghreb and in West Africa and in northern Mali in particular, and drug money. And so we have this enormous, even in The Guardian, which usually knows better on drug issues, we have this enormous excitement about, again, this is not just narcotics that we have to worry about in West Africa, it's narco-terrorism. And boy, even in the middle of a fiscal crisis, which this is in the United States, the money will fly out of the Congress if we're talking about narco-terrorism or any kind of terrorism, right? So there was a big congressional hearing in 2012 about what are we going to do about drugs in West Africa. And the Pentagon was front and center, saying that, you know, this is a terrorism challenge, and we have to get our big guns out. And what I didn't put here and should have is that official after official came before the Congress saying, we need a new Plan Colombia for West Africa. as though that were such a wonderful success. In addition, we have the Drug Enforcement Administration is the U.S. part of the U.S. government that deals, it's actually in the Justice Department, that deals with overseas drug issues. The DEA officials come before the Congress and point out that the penal code in the United States allows for the DEA to intervene, including with military strength, in places where drugs are linked to terrorism. And it doesn't matter if you prove that the drugs ever get to the United States, it doesn't matter any of that stuff. It's that there's a link to terrorism, and that was really the case that was made to the Congress. And so from this hearing came a $60 million program that's small compared to the whole Latin America story, but it's just the beginning, called the West Africa Comprehensive Security Initiative, WACSI, that is starting to be a place where, as the U.S. sees the writing on the wall with Latin Americans tired of their street-level violence, having their sitting presidents, not just former presidents, but sitting presidents call for new policies, the U.S. sees that Latin America is not going to be the place for this activity much longer, or not in the same way, and is looking at West Africa in that way. And I think we certainly have the narrative proof to say that with some confidence, and now we have the hardware moving in. What really is this connection? I mean, we're not talking about the Taliban here. We're not talking about FARC and cocaine. I don't think it's that kind of situation, and neither do a lot of experts. Wolfram Locker is a scholar at the German Institute for International Security Studies, SWP in German, I can't say it. Basically, he's done some really nice on-the-ground work showing that Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb mostly gets its money from kidnappings. I think that was well known, and that the level of drug money that they depend on is tiny compared to all the drug money that's corrupting democratic governments across Africa and across the Maghreb. Virginia Kamoli, who's done some really good writing on the drug war, says that from her research, it's clear that Al-Qaeda is named by local officials when they want to get more U.S. support, because that, again, turns the faucets open. We've been involved with the analysis of a new drug law that I believe we have pretty good evidence was pretty much drafted, or at least heavily influenced, by the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration in Liberia. Liberia is a close ally of the United States. And we think that DEA, which is increasingly present, U.S. agents, drug enforcement agents in West Africa, is going to be pushing this kind of legislation on more and more countries. Liberia, amazingly enough, did not have a drug law, or has not had a drug law to this day. It uses its regular criminal code against drug offenses and also public health law. Instead, they are being pressured, and it's before the Liberian parliament now, to adopt a law that, again, in the way that Nigel South criticized, puts pretty much all drugs on the same level of danger, imposes very harsh penalties for a wide range of drugs and a wide range of offenses, including ones that I would call minor, and also does not give protection against the government basically forcing you into detention for the purpose of treatment. This is a dangerous development. It's the influence that we saw on the Latin American laws. It's an inappropriate use of criminal law. We'll get back to that in a minute. So there's a tendency in some writing on drug policy to sort of blame the harshness of drug laws and that what I think misuse of criminal law for minor offenses on the UN drug conventions. And there's maybe a case to be made for that. There are 3 UN drug conventions. They're widely ratified. For those of you who work in human rights, we're talking widely ratified, more than the Migrant Workers' Rights Convention or the Disappearance Convention. We're talking 190 countries, right? It's too boring and long to get into exactly what's in these conventions, but they're basically prohibitionist in spirit. They have the spirit of we can get rid of drugs, and they, in some sense, encourage the use of criminal law as a tool in that process, though they also talk about the sovereignty of member states and the constitutional frameworks of member states and so on, so there's some flexibility there. I think that the reality, though, is a more nuanced one, and that there are a lot of things that are part of political pressures linked to how drug law and policy are made. And I would say that in Africa in particular, getting back to the point that was made before, donor pressures are really, really, really important. The U.S. takes it upon itself to have its own classification of countries' effectiveness as partners in the war on drugs. And every year the U.S. comes out with a list of countries. The process is a little bit different in recent years, but it used to be a very formal so-called decertification process. And if you were decertified as a country because you were not doing your part in the war on drugs, you would lose all kinds of assistance, you'd be put on all kinds of blacklists, there would be all kinds of sanctions, a little bit what we're seeing with Russia now and Ukraine. And Nigeria, again, the biggest country in population in Africa, in Sub-Saharan Africa, 170 million people, was decertified by the US for a whole long period in the 1990s when it also was under a military government. And that military government constantly said that this was a political move to criticize the military government for other things. It never really had anything to do with drugs. But to get the US off its back, because it lost all kinds of aid, it lost international events, it lost all kinds of things, it really hyped up the seizures and the arrests and in this case, the burning of cannabis on people's fields, again, sometimes poor people for whom that was their livelihood. And during that period of decertification, over 5 million tons of cannabis were ripped out of the ground of people who sometimes false small farmers who were using it for to support their families. And I think there are many people, I took this from our friend Isidore Ogo, who wrote a great article that he's Nigerian, and I'm amazed that he hasn't been killed for this article because it's a very frank assessment of what was going on. But as he says, into the 2000s, this clearly made drug policy in Nigeria about the most repressive measures because that's where they thought they could show the numbers to the US. So drug policy in Nigeria is certainly not about getting health service and social services to people who have drug addiction. This is really a challenge for us across parts of Africa. So Operation Burn the Weed, again, sometimes people's food fields. Cannabis tend to be very much interplanted with food crops in a lot of Africa. I don't know if you're aware that the small countries, Swaziland and Lesotho, have cannabis as a very, very important part of their income. The government pretty much looks the other way because they're getting revenues. And this same sort of thing has been pushed on the Swazis and the Lesotho by certain donors at various times. Khat. You know about khat? How is it that you use khat if you want to use khat? Khat is a plant-based stimulant. Do you know how you get stimulation from khat? You chew. Right, okay, so you know about that. Your mouth turns G. Okay. So khat is an important source of livelihood for many, many farmers in places where, in some parts of the Horn of Africa, especially Ethiopia and parts of Eritrea, parts of Kenya, where other food crops don't grow so easily on mountain slopes and so on, khat is a reliable source of revenue. Khat also has traditional uses. It's very widely used. I mean, these are not your usual figures for something that's an illicit drug. Should khat be illicit? It's not illicit in some places. It's not illicit in Yemen or Djibouti. It is illegal in Ethiopia, I think, right now. Anyway, you see that this is a widely used drug. It's used in social occasions and so on. In Europe, the use of khat is pretty much restricted to diaspora communities, Somali, Ethiopian, Yemeni, as said here. In the UN, in the international drug control system, the authority for determining whether something is dangerous enough to be subject to the control that's spelled out in the drug conventions is a WHO expert committee on drug addiction, which has been pushed and pushed and pushed again to look at khat, has looked at khat several times, most recently in 2006, and basically said, look, it's a stimulant, we would equate it more or less to strong caffeine. We don't see that this needs to be criminalized in the way that the drug conventions suggest. In addition, the Netherlands government, the government of the Netherlands and the government of the UK commissioned very expert people to look similarly at the impact of khat on communities in the UK and the Netherlands, found pretty much the same thing. Clearly, there are four Ethiopian Airlines flights a week into Heathrow with cot, and basically with cot. Cot needs to be refrigerated. It loses its stimulant effect quickly if it's not refrigerated. So it's not, I mean, you're never going to have a huge, big profit margin with cot, but nonetheless, it's got a market and it's an important one. The UK collected several million pounds in tax revenue. That might have been pounds, sorry. And there was never any notion that there was any criminal market generated around cotton places where it was legal, like the UK. This is hard to see, but again, going to Professor South's point, this was an article that was in the very prestigious health journal, The Lancet, whereby a number of, again, experts on drug addiction were asked to rank the harms of various substances. And you see they included alcohol and tobacco as part of it. So where is cot? I mean, we have steroids, we have Ritalin, we have cannabis, we have buprenorphine, we've got everything here. There's cot. These people also don't think that cot is a major threat to social order or health. However, wave of anti-immigration politics, who knows? The Dutch government decides that in spite of the study of the findings of its own scientists, cot will be illegal in the Netherlands. Theresa May last year proposed the same thing for the US. The ban in the UK will go into effect in a few weeks unless there's some sort of outcry. What's going on here? We don't know, but what we know is that now there are criminal networks who have to supply the Netherlands. And what we hear is that a lot of new forms of transporting cot and preserving cot are being tried by these networks because they can't cut in on the KLM flights anymore. But what concerns us is that in the UK, for instance, where we already know and have good research, and I should have put in the slide, about discriminatory practices, racial discrimination in stop and search processes of the police, is this not one more way that people will be able to report their African origin neighbors to the police? Is this not going to exacerbate the stop and search problems that we have? So a small thing, if you happen to want to correspond to your member of parliament on this subject, the House of Lords, which hosts an all-party group on drug policy reform, actually has some members who are very upset that this cot ban has kind of gone through without much scrutiny or public awareness. The nature of this kind of ban is that it doesn't need to be voted on in the Commons. It just needs to go to the Technical Committee for Home Affairs, where there's a Tory membership and it was voted through along party lines. Julian Huppert, who's the chairman of that committee himself, I think is against the ban. In any case, if you felt like doing a little action, this would be the time, because this will quietly go into law, and we will see, as right under our noses, the development of criminal networks who will be supplying now the Somali and the Yemeni and the Ethiopian communities here in the UK with this substance. I mentioned the case of Nigeria having all kinds of pressures to focus on policing and interdiction in its drug policy. It's true in a lot of African countries worried about their US assistance or other assistance they might be getting. UNODC also has really urged countries to focus on seizures and such things. And so we have treatment for drug addiction in these countries that really is not different from torture in a lot of cases. We have also governments that haven't really invested in drug addiction treatment or capacity in their own medical communities, not everywhere, but in some places. So that drug addiction treatment is left to church groups, is left to NGOs, community groups, and some of them believe that you basically need to have a tough love approach, which I think this is a lot more than tough love. I mean, chaining people to a tree is not treatment. And yet we see an awful lot of it in many places. So, George Soros, who founded and funds the foundation where I work, the Open Society Foundation, has had the idea about drug policy, as he has about several other kinds of controversial issues, that if you can't get sitting presidents or sitting political leaders to speak out about the idiocy and the harms of policies, you get former presidents to do that because they have no political costs that they pay for that, right? So he put together, it was really his brainchild, something called the Global Commission on Drug Policy. I really encourage you to look at their materials if you're interested in this story, because it really is a human rights critique that they brought to the drug policy analysis. that they do. You see here Richard Branson, he's not a former head of state, but he's a prominent person. Ruth Dreyfus, the former president of Switzerland, President Cardoso of Brazil, and former President Gaviria from Colombia. And the Global Commission on Drug Policy, also Soros had the brains to include Kofi Annan in the group, though he didn't show up at this press conference, but nonetheless Kofi Annan is a very, very important figure in this group. And they've now put out 3 major reports, one that was a sort of overview of what's wrong with the drug war, a second one about HIV, and a third one about hepatitis C. They're working on one now that's about human security and human rights issues. Much more influential than I think any of us ever thought they would be, partly because people like Ruth Dreyfus are enormously eloquent and have an experience from Switzerland to show how they essentially wiped out HIV linked to drug use, even in their prisons, by changing the way that they approached drugs and the way that they incorporated health people in policy making. So when George Soros invited Kofi Annan to be part of this group, he sort of said, you know, Kofi, we need to bring this to Africa somehow too. And eventually over time, well actually last year, Kofi Annan convened a group of 3 former heads of state, including President Obasanjo from Nigeria, who's the chairperson of the group, former ministers, some civil society representatives, and a Malian popular singer. I should remember her name and I don't. In any case, and this gentleman who is the former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Sierra Leone and a very, very important legal thinker in Africa, the man who signed the arrest warrant for Charles Taylor on the Sierra Leonean side. And I've had the privilege of working with this group for the last year. They're going to bring out a report in a few weeks. It will be launched in Dakar in June. That will actually call for decriminalization of personal consumption of drugs and minor drug possession, which is going to be very, very radical for the politics that is around us in West Africa. And I just wanted to finish by saying a little bit about what conversation we had with these people, all of whom were not drug policy experts. They were just people who Kofi Annan thought would be open to discussing the issue and would have enough clout to draw press attention when they did speak. And we think they will. We're getting a lot of interest in the press already. I think the most, the thing that, I was on a technical group of people who met with them every time they met, and I contributed to some degree to the report, and that was an honor for me to do that. We also funded this, and they didn't invite me, I don't think, because I was a funder, but who knows. Anyway, we really focused on the misuse of criminal law with respect to, first of all, acts for which there is no criminal intent. And Justice Bankole Thompson, the fellow from Sierra Leone, kept saying to us, well, criminal intent is the evidentiary part of what makes something a crime. How could we use the criminal law in this way if we can't even pick out ourselves where the criminal intent is in drug consumption or minor drug possession? That was a very interesting way to go about this. A lot of these people on the commission are lawyers, or they're schooled in the law one way or the other. President Obasanjo himself was a political prisoner for 3 years. He will tell you that he was a prisoner because he advocated too strongly for democracy. I'm not sure historians would agree. But he was in prison. He met a lot of small-scale drug offenders who were there with him for very long periods. And he couldn't understand this. And when he tells this story, it's very, very effective. So that point, which I thought was going to be very hard to get to with the commission, was one that, because of Obasanjo's experience, we were able to get through pretty well. Criminal law applied where there's no evidence of deterrence. We don't have any good evidence that drug laws have a deterrent effect, at least at most levels. Penal sanctions, I mean, the role of criminal law should also be to incapacitate the actor of the offense. We know that drug use continues in prison, drug possession continues in prison, and so on. So we have this kind of conversation. Actually, this is a conversation that I also have with, for instance, Amnesty International chapters around the world. As you'll see in a minute, Human Rights Watch has come out with a really good statement that's being widely used on decriminalization of minor offenses. We can't get that out of Amnesty, but when we have this kind of conversation with them, they totally get it, that criminal law is being misapplied, at least in some circumstances here. We talked a lot with the Commission about what happens when you judge police performance by the number of arrests or the number of seizures. What do you think happens when the police are judged for promotion, for salary increases, and so on the number of arrests that they make? Whom do they arrest? What do you think? You think they're getting their totals up by arresting the biggest drug kingpins? No. They're going to arrest the people, if it's a matter of getting the totals up, they arrest whoever is easiest to arrest, right? And so when we were able to lay that out as a harmful factor for, again, people who are probably involved in drugs because they have no livelihood opportunities in the mainstream economy, that really spoke to the commissions. And we talked about paraphernalia laws, which are crazy. You know, in many countries, including in Africa, you can't possess a clean syringe. It's against the law. It's a paraphernalia offense. Syringe with trace element of a drug will violate a possession law in most countries. Health workers may be required to turn people in, and so on. So all of these things, I think, just appealed on a very basic level of common decency to the people on the Commission. And so we got from the Commission a lot more, a much more progressive statement than I think I ever hoped for going into the exercise. So I'll invite you to pay attention to that in June. I'm sorry that I can't share it with you, it's under embargo, but you'll see it soon enough. This is the statement from Human Rights Watch, which was years in the making. I worked there and tried to get something like this going, and it was just not happening. I left in 2004. My successor was able to take up this discussion. And what I really appreciate a lot about this statement is that it does focus not only on consumption, but also on drug production. So again, this drug crops that we were talking about before. And it's basically a statement about the ease with which repressive drug policies turn into torture and other kinds of human rights abuses, the ease with which they become part of corrupting states and undermining democracy. I think that the one that I see being used most by groups around the world is the part with a clear call for decriminalization of drug use, drug consumption itself, and possession of small quantities. This is really important for a mainstream human rights organization to have said this. And as I say, I find it all over. I was recently in Morocco, where there is a discussion happening that involves cannabis production. Morocco is the biggest producer in the world of hashish, for example, and there's a whole politics and an ethnic element to the production story there too. And when I went to a meeting with some Moroccan parliamentarians and some representatives of the cannabis farmers, and the cannabis farmers all came in with this statement translated into Arabic in their laps. And it was really touching to me. I mean, it was really a message to me about how important human rights organizations can be. And then Human Rights Watch also looks at the health element. Again, chaining people to trees is not something we call treatment. Detaining them for treatment is not treatment. Getting the health people the tools that they need to really deal in humane ways with drug addiction. Also the matter of pain medications, which, as I said before, Human Rights Watch has become very active on. That's the bottom. We really do have a challenge across Africa. The drugs are the most repressive in the world. Some of them are very, very old. They're all about policing. They're all about interdiction and supply reduction. There's very little about standards of health services or social support or anything like that, until the African Union had the idea, thanks to some relatively progressive thinkers in the African Union Commission, like the equivalent of the European Commission to the European Union. African Union is the multilateral body for all of Africa, 54 countries. And I was, again, honored to be invited, and this was definitely not a donor thing because we didn't pay for this, basically because of the work that I did at Columbia. I was one of 2 non-African people invited to be part of the drafting committee for the African Union drug policy. And the previous policies were all policing. And I went into that discussion with one goal, and that was to have some kind of wording that would challenge the states in Africa to look at alternatives to incarceration for minor offenses. That's all I wanted. And it was a battle. But we got that wording in the end, thanks again mostly to the health professionals who were around the table, less to the criminologists. And now the challenge is to find donors who will be interested in helping countries to struggle with that challenge. And that's what we're not doing so well on right now. Lots of human rights language in the policy, which also, again, I think was an important turn on the page. I already showed that to you. Sorry. I'll say that. So, as you may have heard from Rick and others, if you've been talking to them, we're at a key moment right now, too, because we're looking at a UN General Assembly special summit on drugs that will be coming up in 2016. It was originally scheduled for 2019 as one of these every 10-year summits that the UN puts together. And the reason it's in 2016 is that the outgoing president of Mexico, President Santos, of Colombia, and President Otto Perez, who will be in the UK next week, of Guatemala, have been screaming in the halls of the UN General Assembly and got enough people to vote with them that it was really time not to let this go for another 3 years, and it was really time to revisit this global regime. Do we think that this will do any good with this relatively repressive mechanism that's so well entrenched? I don't know. I think it's hard to know. I think there are some positive signs. Going back to the Bolivia case, the Bolivia Cato experience, which is possible or at least facilitated by the fact that Bolivia became the first country in the history of the drug convention since 1961, in 2011, I guess, to withdraw from the drug conventions. Again, the Morales government saying this was done under the military rule, we don't like it, we're going to withdraw, we're going to express our reservation. All of you who know human rights treaties, you know that there's a reservation process, same with the drug conventions. We're going to express our reservation and say that we think there are illicit legal uses of coca. We would like to be able to pursue those as an economic matter and as a social and cultural matter. And then we will rejoin the conventions. Well, they can rejoin the conventions if you read the conventions, unless 1/3 of the ratifying states stop them. And the US, Sweden, our archenemy, Russia,
UK, Japan.
UK, Japan, exactly, yeah. Some of the, well, yeah, the UK, that was unfortunate. Anyway, 15 countries in the end said, no, we don't agree with that, but it wasn't the 63 that was needed. And so we have in Bolivia, in the Bolivian experience, really an example of showing another way that respects people's cultural and economic rights, that is concerned about organizing people who would otherwise depend on an illicit crop for their livelihood. It's a really interesting story, and I think it speaks to also the flexibilities within the treaty process, within the treaty structures. I think there is more social science research happening that helps us, where in fact evidence or research matters, which unfortunately is not everywhere. It's very hard. Sometimes the debates just sort of go past evidence. We definitely need more funding on social science research. Our program is relatively small, and we're funding an awful lot of research and academic work just because national research funding bodies won't fund progressive drug policy analysis. We do have, amazingly, and I mean, I talk about the sins of the US. The US is also beginning to support things like health services for drug users in some key places. Notably in Tanzania, where there's a big methadone program, the biggest one in Africa now, that a government offers for free. It's making a huge difference for this population of people who were injecting heroin. And we brought the Tanzanian policymakers to the African Union at the time that this new 5-year strategy was being debated. And they made an enormous, and I've never seen a meeting like this in the African Union that we had to extend by 3 hours because people were really on the edge of their seat, hearing about how the police in Tanzania are now more interested in helping people get into treatment than arresting them over and over again. Stunning story. I don't think that was the US's intention when they funded the Tanzanian methadone program, but it's a very interesting story that we need to tell better and tell more in Africa. And we worked very hard for a period of years, Rick certainly was part of that, to get UN agencies to denounce this practice of sort of forced labor camps or drug detention centers in the name of treatment. Really, again, more in the reality of torture, but in the name of treatment. And we got a strong statement from 12 UN entities on that last year, not unfortunately the International Narcotics Control Board, which is the treaty body for the drug conventions. They didn't join the statement. So things are happening. The outcry from the Latin Americans has been really, really important. That moved the summit up 3 years. The Western European experiences are still important. being challenged all the time in places like the Netherlands, Portugal, Switzerland, on political grounds that they're too lax. Why do the coffee shops exist in the Netherlands? For one reason, and it's really a harm reduction story very much. Because in the 70s, way before HIV, there were people in the Dutch government who thought that seeing the spread of cannabis use in the 1960s and the countercultural movement, they were not going to be able to keep cannabis out of the hands of young people, but they wanted people to be able to get their cannabis without having to deal with a heroin dealer or a cocaine dealer. That's why the coffee shops exist. Fantastic example of harm reduction, and one that really merits still being talked about, but one that is political football, as you know. This is a kind of amazing thing that I didn't really think that I would see in my lifetime, and that's U.S. Public opinion on the legalization of cannabis, where this stunning reversal happens. And how does that happen? It happens for a lot of reasons, and we can talk about that if you're interested, but basically manifested itself in a vote in 2 U.S. states, as I think you know, Washington and Colorado, the state of Washington, which is a state in the northwestern United States, where there is now complete legalization of cannabis for all uses, for recreational use as well as medical use. And believe me, the enemies of drug law liberalization are in force, trying to prove with data, sometimes falsified, that this is harmful for society. But the experiments are going forward because, in spite of the fact that by the letter of federal law they are illegal under federal law, the Minister of Justice or our Attorney General, with the blessing of the President clearly, said, no, we will allow these to go forward. We'll come down on you like a ton of bricks if we see that your cannabis is arriving in another state. We'll come down on you like a ton of bricks if we see that it's in the hands of children. But one of the reasons that the vote could happen in a place like Colorado is that people advocating for the legalization convinced the population that it would actually be easier to keep cannabis out of the hands of children in a regulated market in the way that it happens for tobacco, rather than in an illegal market where you can't know how children are going to be in contact with dealers. So, an interesting thing that changes what the U.S. can and can't say in international meetings, which is another thing we can talk about more if you're interested. I don't know if you see a familiar face in this now, in the U.S. now famous photo. It's amazing Barack Obama looks so much the same as he did when he was in secondary school. What you have here is a picture of Barack Obama from his secondary school graduation, where apparently in Hawaii, where apparently the dress code is quite casual. And the cake says, class of 1970, whatever it is, I guess, Chungang, that was the name of their cannabis club. And one of Barack Obama's nice friends here helpfully dug this photo out in the middle of the election campaign so that he could be discredited. In any case, the question is, what will the U.S. do in this UN summit in 2016? And there's a lot of thinking about this. There's a whole school of thought, including some people in our Washington office, who say that by the summer of 2016, when the summit will happen, the U.S. will be in the middle of a presidential election campaign. The spotlight will be, by definition, on everyone except Barack Obama, because he can't run and wouldn't run. And so it will be a time for him to actually show what he believes on this issue, and perhaps allow the U.S. delegation to say something that goes beyond the horrible, repressive statements that we always get from the U.S. I don't know if I believe that. I think that if the President were that concerned about this element of his legacy, we might have seen it in other ways. But it is true that a lot of us didn't expect that the federal government would allow the state initiatives on legalization of marijuana to go forward, and they have gone forward. So, there you are. Anyway, that was a little bit longer than I had thought, but thank you so much for your attention, and I'd be really interested in hearing any comments or thoughts you have.
So, comments, questions, covered a wide range. Yes, we're not detaining
That's right.
anybody.
All right, detaining anyone. No detention.
Yes, go ahead.
Can you summarize the, I'm from Sweden, one of the hawks. What can you summarize the arguments against legalization? What are the main arguments against it from countries like Sweden and others?
We heard them all trotted out with great regularity at the annual session of the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs, including by the Swedes. So the Swedes have said for a very long time that you can't control something like cannabis in the way that you can control tobacco, and the Swedes were joining the chorus of people who claim that they have data already that young people in large numbers are spending nights in hospitals because they're ingesting marijuana brownies or pastry or whatever it might be. I don't think that evidence really exists. But the Swedish tradition...
Or in general, there are other arguments, sort of a general argument against.
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, in international legal terms, the argument against it is that a regulated, legalized market is illegal under the International Drug Convention. As Joanne said, there's various, what people in drug policy call flexibilities. So countries can interpret their obligations in certain ways based upon constitutional provisions or whether you allow types of health programs or not. But I mean, fundamentally, if it came down to a regulated legal market of controlled drugs, there's no way you can do that and still be part of the drug conventions. I mean, that goes back 100 years of international law at this point in time. It's not existed. There's 40 or 50 years of international treaty law, not before the UN. So, I mean, fundamentally, there's the legal question. I mean, the political questions, I mean, are much more complicated.
But it's true. I mean, the Swedish civil society has made use over and over as well, again, of the one mention in human rights law that we have of drugs, which is in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which actually, and very unfortunately, talks about protecting children from drugs. So the sort of Save the Children in Sweden and lots of other drug-free Sweden kinds of organizations often make reference to that in their argumentation. They have a long history of arguing for drug-free type policies. On the matter of the illegality, illegality of a fully state-regulated market along the lines of tobacco and alcohol in most countries. And yet, in the Western European experience, really effective decriminalization of cannabis, very little arrest or incarceration related to cannabis, done with interpretations by the international lawyers in Switzerland, in Portugal, and other places, showing the flexibilities of the convention, but not up to, at least not yet in Western Europe, up to the point of a regulated market, which I think will be happening soon, probably in Switzerland. And the Swiss may not care so much about. I mean, I think they will bring their own international law arguments to bear. Cannabis, there's no doubt in my mind that there will be a strong contingent of people wanting to get cannabis completely out of the scheduling of the UN drug conventions at the summit in 2016. I don't think politically that can happen in the current environment in the UN, but it will be a very interesting discussion.
More questions, comments? While you're thinking, I first went to the United States in the 1960s. I left a country, this country, where there was in fact a regulated system. People could register as drug addicts and get drugs. In fact, as I recall, on national health, they got them in limited amounts, and it was safe production and safe distribution. I came back 8 years later. I've been wasting my time on the other side of the Atlantic, and found that there was this new totally repressive regime that had happened. Maybe Rick knows the history. I've never. Okay, I won't ask you. You've actually motivated me to try and find out just how it was possible to happen so quickly, to change the culture around to the point that now, even when they try to make cannabis the lowest level of scheduled drug, it creates all kinds of uproar. I have a comment, I have a question, but coming out of this though, if one decriminalizes just the use, isn't that still leaving the user in the hands of an illegal market and in the hands of criminals? Doesn't it need more than just decriminalization? You said with the cafes in the Netherlands that that takes them away from the criminal providers. But where are the cafes getting there?
Well, exactly, and the Netherlands calls that their backdoor problem, because it is still criminal networks essentially that are supplying the cafes. It's being dealt with. I mean, there is some serious policy thinking happening around that issue. I think that there is a harm reduction case to be made, though, for decriminalization of consumption, if that's the only thing we can do, at least to help people try to understand, as they do so effectively in Portugal, where the drug use comes from in the first place, whether there's something that can be done as sort of a root level support. And it's just so hard to provide those kinds of services when people are constantly worried about police and that. But it's true, I think the Global Commission on Drug Policy has advocated for a much broader sense of decriminalization. I think the whole business of drug crop production, as I've suggested, is it's really neglected. We need to be thinking about how to decriminalize those people's world too. And we're just ourselves getting to that, even though in our foundation people have been doing this kind of thing for a very long time. It's been very hard to organize farmers. It's very hard to get them together if they're afraid of whoever their intermediary is, who's an organized crime figure, finds out that they're trying to do something different. So big challenge.
I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on the attitude shift from the States you mentioned, what some of the drivers for that might be.
Yeah, it's possibly no accident that here the United States is in the midst of a terrible financial crisis. And when we think about taxation capacity at the level of the states, we're talking about property taxes. We're looking at states that a lot of them had people, long-time homeowners who were in default on their mortgages. We're looking at a very limited possibility of getting more revenues out of property taxation. The schools, which are the only public service that the U.S. seriously provides at the state level, need to be funded. Where do you go for that? And in addition, during this whole period, remember, mass incarceration that's costing the states a huge amount of money. And the states actually more than the federal government. Most of the incarceration that we were looking at in those graphs, I'm going to go back to the first slide. Most of the incarceration that we were looking at in those graphs is actually in state-level prisons. Sorry, this is crazy. I just did want to prove that I said thank you. There we are. So we have fiscal pressures obviously being part of that. We have, to some degree, the sort of middle class being hit finally by incarceration too, and not just blacks, because in some states there are for-profit prisons, which is a whole human rights issue in itself, and people are finding their good middle class kids in police lockup or some kind of pretrial detention, or even in county jails because of marijuana offenses, and they're tired of it. So we have a lot of things going on. Actually, also in some parts, and then in a state like Colorado, in Colorado, unlike most of the 50 states in the U.S., one-third of the population registers itself to vote as independent, not as Republican or Democrat. So it's a state with an important streak of independence. At the same time, the vote happens in Colorado at the moment when they have a rather popular governor who made his fortune by being the owner of a string of pubs, who is in a bad position to talk about not generating tax revenue off people's vices. So a lot of things come together at once, and I mean, what else am I missing? I mean, and very, very well organized advocacy. Oh, and this argument that the advocates for legalization were able to mobilize pretty effectively about keeping drugs out of the hands of young people, and the idea that this would be more possible to do in a legalized, regulated market than in a legal market that's hard to control. I think, yeah, well, those are some of the factors and probably things that I'm forgetting. Anyway, really very interesting. And then those two states were smart enough to schedule their statewide referenda at the time of the presidential election when they knew they would get the young vote out. because the Obama people helped them do that very effectively. And so it all worked in their favor, which is why the same, I mean, Colorado and Washington are under the microscope. I think they are being much more careful in their regulation. In Colorado, they call their regulatory system seed to sale to smoke. Basically, every plant practically has a number or an electronic chip or something. I mean, it's a very, very, very strictly regulated system because they are the first, and everybody's watching them. And the Drug Policy Alliance, Ethan Nadelman's group, certainly thinks that this kind of measure will be on the ballot again in the 2016 presidential election year, probably in a few places like Alaska, where there's hardly any law at all, in 2014 or 15. So, yeah, it'll be very interesting to see whether, whether this is something that is the beginning of a trend or something else.
Has there been any change in attitudes internationally since those changes in Washington and Colorado?
Well, you realize as well that there is the first country that is having a countrywide experiment in state regulation of cannabis, which is Uruguay, which is, again, a very unusual story politically because it was really the idea of a very unusual man who's head of state, President Mujica. And he had to sort of convince the population, whereas in Colorado and Washington, this was definitely a grassroots movement that came to a vote. So the Uruguay experiment is certainly on the lips of lots of people in UN meetings on drugs. Uruguay, there are the usual suspects, Japan, Sweden, the US, Russia, and the Islamic republics of X, Y, and Z would all like to see Uruguay be made a pariah in the international system for this. But I think, as I said, I think there is a broad constituency for getting cannabis, at least getting cannabis out of the strictest scheduling category in the UN drug conventions and putting it in the category that recognizes that it has some medical use. And in a way, I think that's where the battle is. And we certainly saw that battle laid out in a pitched way at the UN Narcotic Drugs Commission this last March, where you had the anti-legalization forces lining up academics, and I swear to you, they've planted academics in the state of Colorado whose whole lives have been about talking down the medical potential of cannabis, and then the doctors who have whole practices of people with cancer, with epilepsy, with HIV, with whatever, who say that that the use of cannabis medicinally has transformed their lives. That's going to be one place where the battle is certainly going to continue, and I think sharply in the media in the lead up to this convention. I don't know, I think that cannabis, in Western Europe, cannabis is not something that we think of applying criminal law to particularly, as I said. In Africa, this will be a hard slog. So I think it's really the entrenchedness of the whole drug control regime that influences in some way the degree to which cannabis can emerge as a separation.
I think the other kind of concern, I suppose, generally, is the degree to which any kind of process of reform, if it happens, gets limited strictly to cannabis. Because you look at a lot of those situations Joanne was talking about, particularly whether it's drug injecting in parts of Africa, or Asia, or Central and Eastern Europe, former Soviet republics, and a lot of the human rights abuses that links around that, decriminalization or legalization of cannabis isn't going to have any impact on that at all. So while there certainly would be positive outcomes of reforms related to cannabis, it would also, I think certainly my fear is that cannabis in some way becomes the easy, if the drug warriors have to surrender a small piece of territory in order to save the rest of the fort, we'll hide that off because we can still have our war on drugs, and we can still have our Plan Colombia, we can still have our Plan West Africa, or whatever we're going to do, because we can say it's about cocaine, it's about methamphetamine, and it's about, like really dig into that hard drug, soft drug kind of false dichotomy. So there is that kind of risk as well, and internationally anyway, because you would think, if you were a clever drug warrior and you actually thought you had to surrender a bit of ground, that's a fairly easy bit you can let go and not have to give up any of your other kind of military
Right.
toil.
Well, I saw a hand up over there.
I have a question about, when you were talking about the sort of draconian drug policies in Africa, in particular about arbitrary detention linked to drug-related offenses. You had said that the the laws were fairly old, reaching back sort of maybe decades and decades. When I was doing research last year in North America, looking at Argentina and Ecuador, there was a direct link between the arbitrary detention or sort of the disproportionate amounts of people sentenced to prison linked with aid from the U.S., similar to what you were talking about in your presentation. But if these laws that are in place in Africa actually predate U.S. aid, what's the origin of linking these drug arrests with such disproportionate sentences?
So it is true that a lot of the laws that we see across Sub-Saharan Africa did come about as part of the discussions about whether to ratify the first drug convention in 1961. At that moment, a lot of these countries were newly independent. They relied on technical advice from outside their own borders, in some cases from their previous colonial power. And there are some of those laws. Now, they've been modified over the years, again, sometimes under pressure from the US or whoever might be providing assistance. So I think it's really what strikes me is the countries that have not tried to modify their law very much, or the ones that have tried to effectively impose minimum sentences. Because one thing that must be said about these harsh laws in Africa is that they are dealt with by judges in a very varied way. Only that I think we begin to have good evidence from a lot of these countries that it's the poor who are disproportionately affected and most likely to be incarcerated or to be in pretrial detention for a long time simply because they can't pay their way out, or they can't pay a legal bail, or they can't pay an illegal bribe. And I think we have a little bit of an example. In South Africa, the post-apartheid government, of course, redid the penal code, and they have redone the drug part of their law a number of times, including when it was learned, and remember you have a freer press in South Africa than in many parts, and a more capable press in South Africa than in many parts of the continent. It was learned that some people died fairly mysterious deaths in church-run drug treatment centers. And so the South African law of 2008 is the only one that I know, I think, in Sub-Saharan Africa that actually added pieces on quality of services, monitoring of the quality of services, quality control of drug addiction treatment services, something you would never see in these other laws that are so old, where the health side didn't even come into it. I think this is why I'm so fascinated by the Tanzania experience, because you have essentially a health intervention in the form of this methadone program that has the drug police now thinking very hard about services for, the drug police themselves, remember, heroin addiction in a place like Tanzania and Zanzibar, very visible problem, overdose deaths all the time on the street. The police themselves frustrated seeing their own relatives, their own sons and daughters and nephews die. And to have that wedge of a health program now inspiring a reflection about the whole nature of the criminal law is really, really amazing when you think how long some of these harsh laws have been on the books.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Viewing marijuana as a soft drug, or liberalizing or legalizing, as it were, I'm concerned about that because, where we come from West Africa, really marijuana is the major hard drug that most people have problems with. Most people have problems with. And we are aware of the implications, and our laws in the Gambia, for instance, are so strict, but at the same time they are so modern as well. They go with the times, and really they incorporate all the conventions. We, the magistrates and judges in our country, try to administer the law as per provided, as per the terms, but not, but at the same time, cognizant of the ill effects of drug use to society. So I am just worried, if you could elaborate further on that, on the liberalization of marijuana.
Well, it's a very good point, and I'm very glad you raised it. And I think that this is certainly going to come out when the West Africa Commission report is launched in June. we, in the course of doing this work with these former heads of state and ministers, we didn't have anyone from Gambia on the commission, and we didn't make a visit to Gambia, but we visited 13 or 14 West African countries and talked to healthcare providers. And one thing, and there is this result that keeps coming up in some research as well as in UNODC reports that indicates that cannabis is in fact the drug from which most people find themselves seeking treatment in West Africa, which is not a result you see in any other part of the world. Most people don't require treatment for cannabis addiction, it's just not that frequent. And when we talk to healthcare providers in Senegal, Ghana, Togo, I remember in Guinea, Conakry, they told us all the same thing, that people would often come forward, especially if it was a young person coming with family members, saying that the addiction problem was cannabis, because that's less stigmatizing than saying that it's cocaine or that it's heroin or amphetamine. I don't know, that's anecdotal, it's anecdotal evidence, and I don't mean to be refuting what you say, because I think what you say is reflected in some of the research that we looked at. However, we also were told that it's very rare that somebody is a cannabis user exclusively, that there's almost always polydrug use in the people who come and seek treatment. Another version of the same story, that maybe this is not just cannabis that we're looking at that people are seeking treatment for. So I think that we just don't have good numbers from treatment centers as we do from other parts of Africa. In Southern Africa, there's a very good monitoring system that allows people in an anonymous way to say what their real drug issues are and what they're really consuming. We don't have that from West Africa. So I personally, I guess just because of what I've seen in other parts of the world, have a hard time believing that it's just cannabis use that's driving drug addiction syndromes in places like the Gambia, but I could be wrong.
Thanks for the question. Yes.
Thank you very much for the wonderful presentations. I learned a lot. We hadn't started the meeting to get down to questions. But I would want to follow up on the question that you raised in relation to and him as well, in terms of support for criminalization of these crimes. I come from a country where we tout ourselves as a religious country. And there is a religious dimension to anti-frontiers. So I actually wanted to find out in terms of, because we mentioned about influence of the US, it appears though that apart from the financial support, there is also this religious influence and cultural influence. To the extent that even if the Americans were to actually say, okay, you can do as you want, many countries will still be reluctant to change those laws because of the influence of these two powerful leaders. It's a very interesting question.
Yeah. Where are you from? Right. Yes. The whole role of the religious, of the faith-based, as the U.S. people say, sector in this story is a big one. And of course, we see the role of the U.S. now in all of this rather frightening new legislation about homosexuality across Africa. On drugs, the role of the church has been rather in the provision of services, a little bit less on advocacy. There's a very interesting experience from Kenya, where you are, that was recounted in the literature by Susan Peckerwright, an anthropologist at University of Bristol, I think, who died unfortunately young, who had worked with heroin, people who inject heroin in Kenya and Tanzania for a very long time. And Kenya has been a very difficult place for, unlike Tanzania, for getting the government to be active in providing life-saving health services, including HIV prevention services for people who use drugs. And she basically did, the drug problem was mostly on the coast, and she went from imam to imam, church to church, mosque to mosque, and got the church leaders all understanding that preventing HIV was really important, and that you needed humane services, you couldn't be, tying people to trees and all of this stuff that people did in the name of tough love and treatment. And it was an amazing transformation and a very influential voice for better services for people who use drugs. And then the Attorney General in Nairobi, and the whole idea there was to begin to provide syringes to people who were injecting drugs to start that service. And when that became clear, even though the imams and the pastors and the religious sector was well behind it, the Attorney General killed it. And I think that we don't know that many places, well, the faith-based sectors in a lot of the places where I've visited and worked in Africa, again, haven't really organized themselves as a coherent policy voice so much, but I expect that's coming. It's interesting, though, that the U.S. evangelicals who are working in Africa on drugs are not any longer, at least I don't perceive any longer, that they're opposing methadone treatment, which in the old days was something they would have opposed as sort of one more. So methadone is an opiate drug that is used essentially to stabilize the cravings of somebody and enable them not to have to inject a more harmful opiate, heroin, impure heroin, whatever it might be.
John wants you to draw it to a close.
Yes, sorry.
That clock is 5 minutes slow and
Oh,
we're supposed
sorry.
to end at 10.
Anyway, methadone as an opiate medicine for stabilizing cravings of opiate addiction would have been opposed by the church people a while back. They don't oppose it anymore, and I think that there are a lot of church people in places like Tanzania who really admire the government program because it's been so effective in getting people's lives in order and helping them to be with their families and raising the kids and all that kind of stuff. So I don't think it's a monolith. It might be in Malawi, in those situations, but I think we have a little bit of play with the religious communities to help them be advocates for more humane services.
Okay, and I just realised we have to vacate the room at 10 to 4, and it's now nearly 5 to 4, that clock is slow. So we've been hit with a double whammy. So let me just, sorry there's no more time for any more questions. Let me thank Cheta for the fascinating, informative, making very telling points, and just generally raising awareness, in my awareness at any rate, of the gaps between law and common sense that can sometimes happen. I once learned at law school when I was first an undergraduate, the two overlapping circles, with the bit in the middle being the connection between law and morality and common sense, and it's a very thin bit in this particular area. It's been a wonderful presentation. You've heard from the questions how interested people have been. Thank you so much for coming and doing that, Jeff. The romance.